evening, weary travelers of time. As you settle into your sanctuary of warmth and comfort, let your breathing slow. In through your nose for 4 gentle counts, and out through your mouth for 6. Feel your shoulders drop. We're not just learning about the past tonight, we're finding peace within it. Picture this moment. You have electric lights that banish darkness with a simple switch. Clean water flows endlessly from your tap. Your home is heated without chopping wood or hauling coal. Medicine exists for your headaches. News reaches you in seconds, not months. You are safer, warmer, and more comfortable than the most powerful ruler who ever lived. Tonight, we visit 16th century Russia, not to frighten, but to find gratitude in the warmth of your bed, the security of your walls, the certainty of tomorrow's sunrise. Imagine snow falling outside a wooden palace in 1533. Candles flicker against windows thick with frost. A child named Ivan sits alone by a dying fire, wondering if he'll live to see morning. He has no Netflix to distract him from his fears, no phone to call for help, and no certainty that anyone protecting him today won't betray him tomorrow. This boy will become Ivan the Terrible, not because he chose evil, but because he grew up in a world where trust was deadly, kindness was weakness, and every sunrise brought new reasons to be afraid. As we breathe together, in slowly and out even slower, let's remember something beautiful. You don't live in Ivan's world. You have therapists, not executioners. You have laws, not the whims of frightened tyrants. You have tomorrow's weather forecast, not months of wondering if raiders will come with spring. Tonight's journey isn't about horror, it's about perspective. We'll walk with young Ivan through corridors lit only by torches, where every shadow might hide a knife. We'll feel the cold stone beneath his feet and hear the whispers of nobles who see him as a tool to be used. And in doing so, we'll remember how extraordinary your ordinary evening truly is. So, let your eyelids grow heavy. Let your mind drift like snowflakes against a window. In a few moments, we'll cross centuries to a land where letters took months to travel, where a fever could mean death, where the most powerful man alive slept with a knife under his pillow. But you sleep in safety. You wake to possibilities Ivan never dreamed of. You are warmer than a tsar, safer than a king, more connected to the world than any emperor in history. Take one more deep, relaxing breath. Feel gratitude settle into your chest like warmth from a perfectly tended fire. As we visit the past tonight, we honor how far humanity has traveled from those dark, cold corridors of fear. Welcome to the story of Ivan the Terrible, a reminder that your peaceful sleep is a miracle centuries in the making. A boy king in a world of shadows. Our story begins on a cold, crisp morning in 1530 in Kolomenskoye, a small town just outside Moscow, where the air carries the sharp bite of pine needles and the comforting smell of wood smoke drifting from countless chimneys. Picture a world where the loudest sound isn't traffic or airplanes, but the distant, haunting toll of the Kremlin's bells, echoing across snow-covered fields like the slow, steady heartbeat of an empire. On August 25th, as summer gives way to the brutal Russian autumn, a baby boy is born to Vasily III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, and his wife, Yelena Glinskaya. They call him Ivan, utterly unaware that this tiny, crying infant will one day become Russia's greatest ruler, or its most terrifying monster, depending on who you ask. Little Ivan's first breaths are drawn in a world that would seem utterly alien to us today. Imagine growing up in a palace where your nightlight is a flickering candle that could burn down your bedroom, where central heating means huddling around a massive stone fireplace, and where the background soundtrack of your childhood isn't cartoons or video games, but the constant, hushed whispers of nobles plotting in shadowy corners. The Kremlin, with its towering stone walls and golden domes gleaming like giant golden eggs against the gray sky, is both fortress and prison, a place designed to keep enemies out, but also to keep its inhabitants trapped within its web of political intrigue. When Ivan is barely 3 years old, an age when most kids today are just learning to use the potty, his father dies, leaving him as the Grand Prince of Moscow. Try to wrap your head around this. Imagine a toddler who can barely reach the kitchen counter, suddenly being handed the keys to run not just a business, but an entire country larger than all of Europe combined. It's like making a preschooler the CEO of Amazon, Apple, and Google all at once. His mother, Yelena, steps in as regent, and for 5 precious years, she acts as a protective shield between little Ivan and the wolves circling the throne. Picture her as a fierce mama bear, her voice ringing through the Kremlin's echoing stone halls as she fights to keep the boyars, Russia's scheming noble families, from tearing apart her son's inheritance. But in 1538, when Ivan is only 8 years old, tragedy strikes like lightning. Yelena dies suddenly and mysteriously, with whispers spreading through the palace corridors like wildfire that she was poisoned by those same power-hungry nobles. Imagine being 8 years old and watching your mom's funeral, knowing that the same people crying crocodile tears and patting your head are probably the ones who killed her. The very air in the palace seems to change after Yelena's death, growing thick with suspicion and betrayal, where even the sweet smell of incense from the palace chapel can't mask the stench of ambition and murder. Now young Ivan is completely alone, an orphan surrounded by predators who see him not as a grieving child, but as a golden ticket to unlimited power. These boyars are like the most cutthroat reality TV stars you can imagine, the kind who would sell their own grandmothers for a shot at fame and fortune. Think of them as medieval venture capitalists, willing to do absolutely anything to get their hands on the ultimate prize: control of the Russian throne. The Kremlin, for all its opulence and grandeur, becomes a living nightmare for a grieving child. Picture the most beautiful expensive mansion you can think of, marble floors, gold-plated everything, rooms bigger than most people's entire houses. But now, imagine being a lonely kid rattling around in it, often forgotten at meal times, sometimes going to bed hungry, while the adults who are supposed to care for you are too busy scheming to remember you exist. Despite the palace's wealth, his clothes are often threadbare and ill-fitting because no one bothers to ensure the little prince is appropriately dressed. It's like being the richest kid in school on paper, but showing up wearing clothes from the clearance rack because your guardians are too busy fighting over your trust fund to actually take care of you. The boyars only dust him off and parade him out during grand ceremonies, using him like a fancy prop in their political theater, then shoving him back into the shadows the moment the show is over. But here's where Ivan's story gets fascinating and really dark. This isn't just a tale of a sad, neglected child. Ivan is wickedly intelligent, devouring books with the hunger of someone desperate to understand the world that's been thrust upon him. His tutors are amazed by his sharp mind, quick wit, and photographic memory. He's like that kid in your class who reads encyclopedias for fun and remembers every single detail. However, the isolation and abuse are doing something terrible to his developing psyche. Historical accounts suggest that Ivan begins taking out his rage and frustration on small animals, torturing them in secret, dark experiments that would make modern child psychologists sound every alarm bell imaginable. It's the kind of behavior that today would immediately land a kid in intensive therapy. But in 1540s Russia, nobody was paying attention to the warning signs. Picture a brilliant, angry child who's been repeatedly betrayed by every adult in his life, learning that power and cruelty are the only languages anyone seems to understand. He's like a pressure cooker with a broken valve, building up steam with nowhere for it to go. By age 13, Ivan has had enough of being treated like a powerless puppet. In 1543, he makes a move that shocks everyone. He orders his first execution. A boyar named Andrei Shuisky, who has crossed the young prince one too many times, is literally thrown to a pack of hunting dogs and torn apart. It's like a teenager not just talking back to the school bully, but having them expelled permanently and brutally. This moment changes everything. Suddenly, the boyars realize that the quiet, bookish kid they've been pushing around isn't just some harmless figurehead they can manipulate forever. There's something dangerous brewing behind those intelligent eyes, something that's been festering in the shadows of neglect and abuse. The boy they thought they could control has just revealed that he's been learning different lessons than they intended, lessons about power, fear, and the intoxicating satisfaction of revenge. The Kremlin's atmosphere shifts overnight. Where once there had been casual dismissal of the young prince, now there's a new emotion creeping through those golden halls. Fear. Because If a 13-year-old can order an execution without blinking, what will he be capable of when he's fully grown and crowned as Tsar? This is the moment when Ivan the Child begins his transformation into Ivan the Terrible, and the boyars, who created this monster through their neglect and cruelty, are about to discover that they've been raising a dragon, not a lamb. The coronation of a Tsar. Fast forward to January 1547, and Moscow has transformed into something that looks like a winter wonderland, crossed with the world's most exclusive red carpet event. The entire city is blanketed in thick, pristine snow that crunches underfoot like nature's own confetti, while the Kremlin buzzes with an energy that's part Super Bowl excitement, part royal wedding hysteria. Picture this: thousands of people flooding into Moscow from across the vast Russian Empire, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the bitter cold as they huddle together in anticipation. The air itself seems alive, thick with the sweet, heavy scent of frankincense and myrrh wafting from every church, mixed with the smoky aroma of countless wood fires and the musky smell of hundreds of fur coats pressed together. It's like being inside the world's most atmospheric concert venue, where every church bell in the city is ringing in perfect, thunderous harmony, creating a sound so powerful it seems to make the very ground vibrate beneath everyone's feet. Inside the Assumption Cathedral, think of it as Russia's version of Westminster Abbey, but even more ancient and mystical. The atmosphere is absolutely electric. This isn't just any old church. This is where Russian rulers have been crowned for centuries, and the walls themselves seem to pulse with history. Golden icons stare down from every surface like divine paparazzi, their painted eyes reflecting the light of thousands of candles that flicker and dance, casting shadows that seem to bring the painted saints to life. The cathedral is packed tighter than a sold-out Taylor Swift concert, with everyone from the wealthiest nobles in their imported silks and priceless furs to common merchants who have saved for months just to afford the journey to Moscow. But despite the incredible crowd, you could hear a pin drop as all eyes focused on one person: Ivan, standing at the altar like he was born for this moment. At just 16 years old, younger than most high school seniors, Ivan is about to claim a title that will make him more powerful than any European monarch of his time. The word Tsar isn't just fancy vocabulary. It literally means Caesar, connecting Ivan to the legendary Roman emperors who once ruled the known world. It's like a teenager being handed the keys to a car and an entire military industrial complex. Metropolitan Makary, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and basically the Pope of Russia, approaches with a crown so heavy it's like wearing a golden bowling ball studded with jewels that could buy entire cities. As he places it on Ivan's head, the gems catch the candlelight and explode into rainbow patterns that dance across the cathedral walls like the world's most expensive disco ball. But this isn't just about fancy jewelry. When Ivan kneels and Makari anoints him with holy oil, it's the medieval equivalent of getting verified on social media, except the verification comes directly from God Himself. Blessed and consecrated oil is meant to mark Ivan as divinely chosen, untouchable, and answerable only to the Almighty. As the congregation erupts in chants of many years, their voices echo off the vaulted ceiling like thunder. Ivan rises as Tsar Ivan IV, and you can practically feel the shift in cosmic power. Think of it like the moment in superhero movies when the hero finally accepts their destiny and puts on the suit for the first time. Except this suit comes with the power to control the lives of millions of people across 2 continents. The ceremony itself is loaded with oaths and promises that sound beautiful, but hide some serious fine print. Ivan swears to protect the church, uphold justice, and defend his people, all noble goals that get a standing ovation from the crowd. But there's an unspoken understanding floating through that incense-heavy air. Ivan's word is now literally law. No appeals, no higher court, no constitutional limits. What the Tsar says goes, period. After the crowning comes the victory lap, a procession through Moscow streets, part parade, part religious festival, and part political statement. Picture Ivan mounted on a magnificent white stallion, his golden robes flowing behind him like liquid sunshine, while thousands of people line the snow-packed streets cheering like their lives depend on it, which, honestly, they probably do. The procession moves through Moscow like a golden river, with nobles on horseback, clergy carrying religious banners, and ordinary citizens throwing flowers and shouting blessings. Street vendors hawk hot food and warm drinks to keep the crowds energized, while children scramble to get the best view of their new czar. It's a moment of pure unity and hope, where all of Russia's social classes come together for just a few hours to celebrate their shared future. But if you look closely at the faces in the crowd, you can see something else mixing with the excitement. A kind of nervous anticipation, like watching a really talented performer about to go on stage when you're not quite sure if they're going to deliver a masterpiece or have a complete meltdown. Many people in that crowd already know about Ivan's, let's call them, disciplinary methods with the boyars. They're cheering, but also mentally taking notes about who to avoid upsetting. As the sun sets on this historic day, the celebration moves inside the Kremlin for what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of the Met Gala after party. The feasting halls are transformed into something out of a fantasy movie, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic delicacies, and enough alcohol to float a ship. Musicians play everything from traditional Russian folk songs to sophisticated court compositions, while dancers perform elaborate routines that tell stories of Russian victories and legends. But even in the middle of all this celebration, there's an undercurrent of tension you could cut with a knife. The boyars, dressed in their finest clothes and wearing their most diplomatic smiles, are essentially attending a party thrown by someone they've spent years trying to manipulate and control. Now, that person has just been handed absolute power over their lives, fortunes, and futures. It's like being at a surprise party for someone you've been secretly badmouthing, and suddenly realizing they've heard every word. Ivan, meanwhile, is playing the role of gracious host, while his mind is undoubtedly racing with plans. You can almost see the gears turning behind his eyes as he accepts toasts and congratulations, mentally cataloging who's being genuine, who's being fake, and who might need to be dealt with in the very near future. 2 weeks later, Ivan caps off his power transformation with what might be the most elaborate wife-hunting expedition in history. Over 1,500 noble daughters from across the empire are paraded before him in what's essentially a medieval version of The Bachelor. Except the stakes are infinitely higher. These aren't women competing for roses. They're competing to become the mother of future tsars, and potentially the most powerful woman in Russia. Anastasia Romanovna emerges as the winner of this royal beauty pageant. But calling it a beauty contest doesn't do justice to what's really happening. This is a carefully orchestrated political alliance disguised as a romantic choice. Anastasia isn't just beautiful. She's from the right family, has the right connections, and most importantly, has the kind of calm, steady personality that can handle being married to someone as volatile as Ivan. When contemporary accounts describe Anastasia as having a calming influence on Ivan, think of her as being like the perfect playlist for someone with severe anxiety. She somehow knows exactly how to soothe Ivan's increasingly stormy moods and paranoid thoughts. In a world where most people are either trying to manipulate Ivan or stay as far away from him as possible, Anastasia becomes the one person he actually trusts. Their wedding celebration lasts for days and is essentially a second coronation, cementing their personal union and Ivan's transition from traumatized prince to confident ruler. For a brief, shining moment, everything seems to be falling into place. The young Tsar appears ready to rule with wisdom and justice, guided by his new bride's faith, advisors, and steadying influence. But here's the thing about fairy tale beginnings. They have a way of making the eventual darkness seem even more shocking when it finally arrives. And in Ivan's case, that darkness is already gathering on the horizon, just waiting for the right moment to eclipse everything, reforms that shaped a nation. Here's where Ivan's story takes a surprising turn that might completely change how you think about him. For the first 15 years of his reign, from 1547 to the early 1560s, Ivan wasn't the bloodthirsty tyrant that history remembers. Instead, he's more like a visionary tech entrepreneur determined to drag his entire country kicking and screaming into the modern world. Except his startup is the largest nation on Earth. This, Ivan, barely out of his teens, decides that Russia's entire governmental system is held together with medieval duct tape and prayers. So what does he do? He assembles what's essentially the world's first government think tank, surrounding himself with the brightest minds he can find. His inner circle includes brilliant advisors like Alexei Adashev. Think of him as Ivan's Steve Jobs, who can take big ideas and make them work, and Sylvester, a priest who's like having a moral compass with a PhD in political science. Together, they form something called the Chosen Council, which sounds fancy, but it is just Ivan saying, I'm tired of making decisions based on whoever screams the loudest. It's like replacing a chaotic group chat with an organized Zoom meeting where everyone can speak and contribute meaningful ideas. One of Ivan's most revolutionary moves is creating the Zemsky Sabor. And this is where things get really interesting. Imagine if, instead of just having rich people make all the political decisions, you suddenly gave ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, farmers, craftsmen, an actual vote in how the country should be run. That's essentially what Ivan does, and it's absolutely mind-blowing for the 1550s. Think about it this way. While most of Europe still operates under the "because the king said so" system of government, Ivan is inventing democracy 200 years before it becomes trendy. The Zemsky Sabor includes representatives from nobles, clergy, merchants, and even ordinary people. It's like having a government that actually looks like the population it serves, rather than just a country club for wealthy families. This isn't just some token gesture, either. These assemblies have absolute power to influence central taxes, laws, and even foreign policy decisions. It's like upgrading from a dictatorship, where one person makes all the decisions, to a system where everyone gets a seat at the table. Revolutionary doesn't even begin to cover it. In 1550, Ivan tackles what might be an even bigger problem: Russia's completely broken justice system. The Sudebnik, his new legal code, is like taking a courthouse that's been run like a corrupt casino and turning it into an actual place where justice might occasionally happen. Before Ivan's reforms, Russian judges were basically freelancers who made up rules as they went along, often deciding cases based on whoever paid the most enormous bribe or had the most intimidating friends. Picture trying to play a video game where the rules change randomly every 5 minutes, and the only way to win is to slip the game developer some cash under the table. That was Russian justice before Ivan stepped in. His new code is like releasing a comprehensive rule book that everyone can read, understand, and most importantly, count on being the same tomorrow as it is today. The Sudebnik doesn't just standardize punishments, but introduces radical concepts like evidence and fair trials. It establishes the presumption of innocence, requires witnesses for major crimes, and even sets up an appeals process for regular people. This is like upgrading from a system where getting arrested basically meant you were doomed, to one where you might actually have a chance to prove your innocence. But Ivan's not just reforming the courtroom, he's completely revolutionizing Russian military power. The Streltsy, his new professional army, represents a massive shift from medieval warfare to something approaching modern military strategy. Before this, Russian armies were essentially temporary mobs of farmers and craftsmen who got dragged away from their day jobs whenever there was a war, led by nobles who inherited their military positions the same way you might inherit your grandmother's jewelry. The Streltsy system is like replacing a volunteer fire department with a fully trained, full-time professional fire department equipped with the latest technology and knows what they're doing. These soldiers are paid regular salaries, live in military barracks, train constantly, and most importantly, answer directly to the Tsar rather than to various noble families who might have their own agendas. This creates something Russia has never had before: a military force that can respond to threats immediately, rather than spending months trying to convince various nobles to contribute troops. It's like having a standing army that's always ready to deploy, rather than having to send out group texts every time there's an emergency. Ivan's approach to building loyalty in his government is even more revolutionary. Instead of relying on the old hereditary nobility, people who got their jobs because their great-great-grandfather was friends with a previous Tsar, Ivan created an entirely new class of service nobility based on merit and loyalty. These are people who earn their positions through actual skill and dedication, rather than just being born into the right family. Think of it as replacing a company where all the executive positions are filled by the boss's relatives, with one where people get promoted based on their performance and results. Ivan hands out land grants and titles to soldiers, administrators, and advisors who prove themselves useful and loyal, creating a whole new power structure that owes its existence entirely to him. This isn't just smart politics. It's a brilliant long-term strategy. By creating a class of people whose wealth and status depend entirely on the Tsar's favor, Ivan builds an unshakable base of support, while simultaneously undermining the power of the old noble families who've been causing him problems since childhood. And then there's his most forward-thinking move: bringing the printing press to Russia. In an age when most people can't read, and information travels about as fast as a horse can gallop, Ivan recognizes that controlling the flow of information is just as crucial as controlling armies or tax collection. The printing press in 1550s Russia is like introducing high-speed internet to a place that's still using carrier pigeons. Suddenly, ideas, laws, religious texts, and government proclamations can be mass-produced and distributed across the empire quickly and accurately. No more relying on scribes who might make copying errors, or deliberately change important documents. Now the Tsar's words can reach every corner of his vast empire exactly as he intended them. This technological leap doesn't just improve communication, it fundamentally changes how power works in Russia. When the government can quickly and reliably communicate with local officials across thousands of miles, it becomes possible to govern a territory as vast as Russia in a coordinated way, rather than just hoping that distant provinces follow orders. These reforms work together like pieces of a massive puzzle, creating something unprecedented. A centralized, efficient, modern state that can function across enormous distances and diverse populations. Ivan isn't just making minor improvements to an existing system. He's essentially building an entirely new kind of government from scratch. For the first time in Russian history, there's a system where ordinary people have a voice. Justice follows predictable rules. The military answers to the state rather than to individual nobles, and information can flow freely across the empire. It's like watching someone take a collection of warring medieval fiefdoms and transform them into something that resembles a modern nation-state. The results speak for themselves. Russia becomes stronger, more prosperous, and more unified than it's ever been. Trade flourished, the military became a formidable force, and for the first time, people across the empire started thinking of themselves as Russians rather than just subjects of whatever local noble happened to control their area. But here's the tragic irony of Ivan's story. Just as he's proving that he might be one of history's most enlightened rulers, personal tragedy is about to trigger a transformation that will turn all of these progressive achievements into the foundation for one of history's most brutal tyrannies. The same organizational skills and governmental efficiency that Ivan uses to modernize Russia will soon be turned toward much darker purposes. It's like watching someone build the perfect tool for creating a better world, only to see them eventually use that same tool to tear everything down. Conquests and cathedrals. But Ivan's not just about paperwork. He's got big dreams of making Russia a powerhouse. In 1552, he leads a massive army to conquer Kazan, a Tatar stronghold 400 miles away. Picture a medieval siege like a blockbuster movie. Cannons booming, a wooden fort floated down the Volga River, and Ivan's troops storming the city's walls. The siege lasts months, with Ivan's forces building fortifications and bombarding the city. Inside Kazan, the defenders fight bravely, but are outnumbered and outgunned. On October 2, 1552, Russian troops storm the city walls, and after brutal hand-to-hand combat, Kazan falls. Ivan orders the execution of its leaders and the destruction of its mosques, seeing this as a holy war to Christianize the Muslim Tatars. This victory is huge, securing the Volga trade route and opening the door to Siberia. To celebrate, Ivan commissions St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square. Its colorful domes like a scoop of rainbow sherbet against the gray sky. There's a legend, probably false, that he blinded the architect, so he'd never build anything so beautiful again. It's a wild story, like something you'd hear about a jealous rock star. Still, it shows how Ivan's reputation for ruthlessness was already growing. In 1556, he annexed Astrakhan, another khanate on the Volga, without much resistance, giving Russia control over the entire Volga River, from Moscow to the Caspian Sea. The conquest of these Tatar territories wasn't just about land, it was like Russia finally breaking free from centuries of being the neighborhood kid getting picked on by bullies. For over 200 years, Russian princes had to bow and scrape to Mongol and Tatar khans, paying tribute like protection money to the mob. Now Ivan was flipping the script, turning Russia from tribute payer to tribute collector. The psychological impact was massive, like a former victim becoming the strongest person in the room. But Ivan's military machine was more sophisticated than just brute force. He revolutionized Russian warfare by creating the first regular army units, the Streltsy, professional musketeers, who were like Russia's version of special forces. These weren't peasants grabbed from the fields. They were career soldiers with matching uniforms, standardized weapons, and steady pay. Think of them as Ivan's army loyal to the Tsar rather than local nobles. This military reform was as groundbreaking as switching from a militia to a professional police force. Then there's the Livonian War, starting in 1558 and dragging on for 24 years. Ivan wants access to the Baltic Sea to open trade routes with Western Europe. The Livonian Confederation was weak, so at first, Russia made gains, capturing cities like Dorpat and Narva. However, things got complicated when Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden joined the war, seeing Russia's expansion as a threat. The conflict turns into a quagmire, with shifting alliances and constant battles. The war becomes a perfect example of mission creep. What started as a quick grab for Baltic ports turns into an exhausting marathon. Ivan's forces are like a boxer who dominates the first few rounds, but gets worn down by a tag team of opponents. Poland-Lithuania brings cavalry that fights like medieval tanks, while Sweden's troops are disciplined and well-equipped. Meanwhile, Denmark jumps in and out of the conflict like an opportunistic investor, switching sides based on who's winning. The economic toll is devastating. Imagine trying to fight a war while your economy is already stretched thin. It's like maxing out your credit cards to pay for a lawsuit. Russian peasants are conscripted away from their farms, leaving fields unplanted. Trade routes are disrupted, cities are burned, and the treasury bleeds gold faster than a punctured balloon. Contemporary accounts describe villages so empty they look like ghost towns, with wolves roaming through abandoned settlements. In 1571, while Ivan was preoccupied with the war, Crimean Tatars raided Moscow, burning much of the city and taking thousands of captives. A humiliating blow. It's like having your house robbed while you're out trying to expand your business empire. The Tatar raid isn't just militarily damaging. It's a massive psychological defeat, showing Ivan's enemies he can't protect his capital while pursuing foreign adventures. The aftermath of the Moscow raid is apocalyptic. Contemporary witnesses describe the sky as black with smoke for days, the Kremlin's walls scorched, and entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Thousands of Russians are marched south in chains to be sold in slave markets. A grim reminder that even as Russia was conquering others, it remained vulnerable to the same fate. Ivan's response is typically brutal. He executes several military commanders and reorganizes his entire defensive strategy. By the end, Russia lost most of its gains, and the war drained the country's resources, like a budget stretched too far on a shopping spree. The Treaty of Jam-Zapolsky in 1582 forces Ivan to give up nearly all his Baltic conquests, keeping only a tiny stretch of coastline. It's a crushing defeat that leaves Russia economically crippled and militarily exhausted, the kind of strategic blunder that historians still study as a cautionary tale about overreach and poor resource management. The dark turn, the Oprichnina. Then, in 1560, everything changed. Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's wife, his anchor in a world of ambition and betrayal, died suddenly, just 30 years old. Her loss didn't just leave the Kremlin colder. It cracked something profound inside the Tsar himself. The corridors of power grew silent, the once lively court now cloaked in suspicion. Ivan was convinced she'd been poisoned by the boyars, the old nobility who had always eyed his authority with quiet contempt. Centuries later, traces of mercury found in her remains would offer a chilling echo of his paranoia. Perhaps he wasn't entirely wrong, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. Her death was a fuse, silent, smoldering. And when it burned out, Ivan exploded. Once obsessed with justice and order, the young reformer now saw traitors in every face and betrayal in every whisper. His moods turned with the violence of a blizzard sweeping across the steppes, sudden, furious, and impossible to predict. Then, in 1564, he staged his most theatrical moment yet. Abandoning Moscow, he loaded wagons with gold and relics, rode off like a thundercloud, and left his capital to descend into chaos. When the people begged him to return, he agreed, but on one horrifying condition: absolute, unquestionable power. Thus began the Oprichnina. It wasn't just a political decree, but a descent into organized madness. Ivan carved out a portion of Russia to rule directly, like a god king, free from laws, reason, or restraint. And to enforce his will, he created the Oprichniki, his black-robed executioners, his personal cult of terror. They were a cross between medieval inquisitors and death's horsemen, dressed in jet black, faces often hidden behind heavy hoods. They galloped through towns on coal dark horses, severed dog heads strapped to their saddles, symbols of their divine right to sniff out betrayal. To see them riding into town was to see the end of your life galloping straight toward you. Under the Oprichniki, Russia transformed into a country-sized torture chamber. From 1565 to 1572, the Oprichnina soaked the land in blood. Villages vanished overnight, lands were seized, and families were torn apart. No one, not noble, not priest, not peasant, was beyond suspicion. Imagine this. It's the middle of winter. The sky is the color of lead. You wake to the sound of hooves and shouting. The air outside smells like frozen dung and wood smoke, but beneath it, a sharp stench of charred meat and something else. Fear, sweat, blood. You pull your children under the bed, hoping they won't cry, but the black robes are already kicking in the door. You don't plead. There's no use. One wrong glance, one misheard word months ago, and now your name's on a list. They tie you up and drag you to the square. Someone screams. Someone else laughs. And then comes the iron heated red in the fire, the rope, or the horses. There's creativity in the cruelty. Boiling, impalement, limbs pulled until the bones snap like branches. And this isn't just happening to one or two. It's thousands upon thousands. An entire nation learning to speak in whispers, to trust no one, to keep the children inside at all times, not because of wolves, but because of men in black who killed with the blessing of the Tsar. Then came the worst chapter, the massacre of Novgorod, 1570. Ivan believed the ancient city was plotting treason, so he sent in the Oprichniki, like wolves, into a pen. For 5 weeks, the town became a living nightmare. Churches, sacred places, were looted and burned. Priests were beaten in front of their congregations. Merchants were roasted alive over giant metal griddles. Families were tied together and drowned in the icy Volkhov River, entire generations disappearing into the black water without a sound, except the splash and the screams. Eyewitnesses wrote of the stench rising from Novgorod: smoke, scorched skin, blood, human waste, and winter rot. The air itself seemed to decay. Once proud and bustling, the city became a haunted shell, its streets littered with corpses. The snow dyed red, the silence broken only by the wind howling through burnt-out homes. And still, Ivan watched. Still, he ordered more. This was no ordinary tyranny. It was a state built on fear and fire, on the belief that love was weakness, that mercy was betrayal, and that a ruler was strongest when everyone else trembled. The Oprichnina wasn't just a political strategy. It was Ivan's madness made real, his grief and rage turned into an institution. It was as if his heart had shattered when Anastasia died, and the shards had been forged into weapons. When the Oprichnina finally ended in 1572, nothing had truly ended. The scars were everywhere on the land, on the minds of survivors, In the empty homes and unmarked graves, Russia had been reshaped not by progress, but by pain. A chaotic personal life. Ivan's personal life is just as chaotic. After Anastasia's death, he marries multiple times, possibly 8 wives, though only 4 are church approved. His second wife, Maria Temryukovna, is a Circassian princess, chosen to strengthen ties with the Caucasus region. She bears him a son, Vasily, but dies shortly after childbirth. Ivan suspects foul play again. His third wife, Marfa Sobakina, dies just weeks after their wedding, possibly from poisoning. By this point, Ivan is convinced that everyone around him is plotting against him. He then marries Vasilisa Melentieva, but she's tonsured as a nun before they can consummate the marriage, so it doesn't count. His fifth wife, Maria Dolgorukaya, is also sent to a convent. His sixth marriage is to Anna Koltovskaya, with whom he has 2 children, but she too is sent away. Finally, he marries Maria Nagia, who gives birth to his son Dmitri. But by then, Ivan is old and paranoid, and their marriage is unhappy. Being Ivan's wife is like signing up for a high-stakes reality show with no guarantee of survival. Perhaps the most tragic event is the death of his son, Ivan, in 1581. During an argument, Ivan strikes his son Ivan Ivanovich with a staff, causing fatal injuries. The painting by Ilya Repin captures this moment perfectly. Ivan holding his dying son, his face twisted in horror and guilt. This act nearly ends the Rurik dynasty, leaving Ivan's weaker son Fyodor as heir. The mind of a czar. Historians speculate Ivan suffered from mental health issues, possibly bipolar disorder or paranoia, worsened by his childhood and Anastasia's death. Imagine a ruler whose mood swings are like a stormy sea, calm one moment, raging the next. He'd pray for hours, his voice echoing in the Kremlin's chapels, then order executions, his mind a battlefield of faith and fury. Some even suggest he had a temporal lobe syndrome, linking his outbursts to possible epilepsy. Ivan's deep faith in the Orthodox Church was a constant in his life. The Church was the heartbeat of Russia, its golden icons glowing in candlelit churches. Ivan often prayed for hours, seeking divine guidance, but his faith didn't stop him from clashing with the clergy or sacking monasteries during the Oprichnina. It's like a CEO donating to charity while firing half the staff. Contradictory, but very human. Life in Ivan's Russia. Let's explore what life was like in Ivan's Russia beyond the throne. In the 16th century, Europe was buzzing with the Renaissance. Think artists like Michelangelo painted ceilings in Italy. But Russia, it was still shaking off the Mongol yoke, a centuries-long shadow of conquest. Villages were clusters of wooden huts, their roofs dusted with snow, the air smelling of pine and peat fires. Peasants worked the fields, their hands rough from plowing, their lives tied to the land and the whims of nobles. In Moscow, The markets bustled with traders selling furs, honey, and wax, while church bells rang out, calling the faithful to prayer. For the average person, life was tough. Imagine working a job with no days off, no sick leave, and a boss who could have you whipped for looking at him wrong. That was life under the boyars, who owned vast estates and treated peasants like property. Ivan's reforms, like restricting peasant movement, laid the groundwork for serfdom, a system that chained people to the land for centuries. Yet, he also tried to curb noble power, giving some hope to the common folk, like a politician promising change, but delivering it with a sword. Ivan's global ambitions. Let's zoom out to the bigger picture. Ivan's Russia was a land on the edge of Europe, looking both east and west. He opened trade with England, even asking Queen Elizabeth I for asylum if things went south. Imagine texting a foreign leader for a backup plan. That's Ivan's style. His conquests, like Kazan, pushed Russia toward Asia, while his failed Baltic wars showed his limits. He was playing a global chess game, but sometimes he knocked over the board. The final days and legacy. By the time Ivan died in 1584, playing chess in Moscow, Russia was a shadow of its former self. His wars and purges have drained the treasury, and the time of troubles looms, a period of chaos that nearly tears Russia apart. Picture the Kremlin's halls, quiet now, the air heavy with the scent of wax and old blood. Ivan's gone, but his shadow lingers. His legacy is complex. He expanded Russia's borders, centralized its government, and set the stage for future empires. Some, like historian Robert Whipper, saw him as a champion of the ordinary people, while others, like Nikolai Karamzin, called him a tormentor. Even Joseph Stalin admired him as a strong ruler. In Russia, he's seen as the father of the state, but internationally, his name is synonymous with ruthless dictatorship. For high schoolers, think of Ivan as a gritty novel character, brilliant, flawed, and unforgettable. His story reminds us that power can create or destroy, depending on the hands that wield it. As you drift off, imagine those snowy Russian plains where a young boy became a tsar, and a tsar became a legend, terrible, awe-inspiring, and forever etched in history. Good night, history travelers, and I'll see you next time for another tale from the past.